Every morning you wake up, fill your gas tank, pay your electric bill, shop online. You are participating in a global financial system that most Americans were never taught about in school. That system doesn't just determine the price on the sign at your local gas station. It determines the mortgage rate you're paying right now. It determines why manufacturing jobs left the towns of the American Midwest. And it determines why the US dollar still dominates the world, even as America produces far less than it once did. If you watch this video to the end, you will never look at a dollar bill the same way again. Not because it's worthless, but because you will see that behind that green piece of paper lies an enormous architecture of power, engineered with more sophistication than any conspiracy theory you've ever heard. And it is transforming right now as we speak. Before we begin, this is Tommy Talks Economy. This analysis is based on publicly available data from the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the U.S. Department of the Treasury, and peer-reviewed academic sources. Nothing in this video constitutes investment advice, represents any organization, and every argument presented here can be challenged when new data emerges. The sole objective is to give you an analytical framework so you can reach your own conclusions. To understand the petrodollar, you have to go back to July of 1944. At a small hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, 44 nations sat down together to redesign the financial order of the world after 2 world wars. What came out of that conference was an agreement that, to this day, still shapes how the global economy functions. Under the Bretton Woods Agreement, the US dollar was pegged to gold at $35 per troy ounce. Every other currency in the world would peg to the dollar, and the dollar would peg to gold. The United States at that time held approximately 70% of the total gold reserves of the capitalist world, according to research documents from the International Monetary Fund. Trusting the dollar wasn't a choice, it was pure mathematics. However, built into that design from the very beginning was a fundamental contradiction that economist Robert Triffin identified as early as 1960. To supply enough liquidity for an expanding global economy, the United States had to continuously print and export dollars. But the more dollars it exported, the thinner the corresponding gold backing became. This is the Triffin dilemma, and it planted the seeds of Bretton Woods' destruction from its very first days. Throughout the 1960s, the United States faced a dual budget squeeze from 2 simultaneous sources. The first was the enormous cost of the Vietnam War. The second was the sweeping domestic social spending programs under President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society Initiative. The U.S. government had no choice but to print money to cover the deficit, and the volume of dollars circulating globally began to far exceed what the gold reserves at Fort Knox could credibly back. European nations quickly recognized the imbalance. French President Charles de Gaulle, who spoke most forcefully on the issue, called it America's exorbitant privilege, a phrase coined by French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. France didn't stop at rhetoric. They sent warships to New York to physically transport gold back to Paris, converting dollars into gold at exactly the $35 rate that Bretton Woods guaranteed. Shortly after, the United Kingdom requested the conversion of $100 million into gold. America's gold reserves were facing the very real risk of being drained. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon appeared on national television and announced a unilateral decision that would permanently alter the architecture of global finance: the suspension of the dollar's convertibility into gold. No consultation with allies, no international negotiations, no advance warning. History calls this the Nixon Shock. An agreement that had stood for 27 years collapsed in 15 minutes of live television. The vacuum Bretton Woods left behind was not one the United States could afford to leave open for long. A country whose currency was no longer backed by gold would lose the foundation upon which the world's trust in that currency rested. Washington needed a new anchor, not a metal anchor, but a strategic one. And at precisely that moment, the oil market exploded into a geopolitical flashpoint. In October of 1973, the Arab members of the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries launched an oil embargo to punish Western nations that had supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Global oil prices quadrupled in less than 6 months. Lines stretched for miles at gas stations across America. Inflation surged. The Western economies reeled. That energy crisis exposed a truth that policymakers in Washington had never been forced to confront so directly. The modern economy does not run on gold. It runs on oil. Any nation that controls the flow and the pricing of oil holds leverage over the entire global industrial system. Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State under Nixon, and then Ford, was the one who saw opportunity inside the crisis. Rather than simply trying to limit the damage from the embargo, Kissinger approached the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia with a proposal designed to build a new system from the ground up. The U.S.-Saudi relationship dated back to 1945, when President Franklin Roosevelt met King Ibn Saud aboard the USS Quincy. But that was a relationship built on oil and geopolitics. Kissinger wanted to transform it into the foundation of a global financial architecture. In 1974, the U.S.-Saudi Arabia Joint Commission on Economic Cooperation was signed. Documents declassified through the Freedom of Information Act in 2016 revealed the true nature of that agreement. This was not simply a standard cooperation treaty. The United States committed to providing military security guarantees, advanced weaponry, and technical assistance to Riyadh. In return, Saudi Arabia agreed to maintain the practice of pricing oil in U.S. dollars and to recycle oil revenues back into U.S. Treasury securities and the American financial system. However, one critical point that mainstream analysis frequently gets wrong deserves clarification here. This agreement was not a technical directive mandating that oil be priced in dollars. It was a strategic alignment of interests where both parties found it more advantageous to sustain the existing system than to dismantle it. That is the difference between a coerced contract and a self-reinforcing architecture, and that distinction becomes critically important when we examine what happened in 2024. Riyadh's agreement created a cascading effect that Washington had calculated precisely. Saudi Arabia was not simply an oil-exporting nation. It was the country with dominant influence inside the Organization of the Petroleum-Exporting Countries. In 1975, every remaining member of that bloc from Iran and Iraq to Kuwait, Venezuela, and Nigeria unanimously agreed to accept oil payments exclusively in U.S. dollars. Within a single year, the physical gold anchor of Bretton Woods had been completely replaced by something else, something the world needed even more than gold: energy. The petrodollar was not a system designed in a conference room and handed down by decree. It was a system in which every participating nation found its own reason to choose preservation over disruption. And that is precisely what made it more durable than any international treaty. Looking back across that entire arc of history, one thing emerges with unmistakable clarity. The collapse of Bretton Woods was not a defeat for America. In a certain sense, it was the starting point for a system even more powerful because it was no longer constrained by the physical limits of a finite gold reserve. To understand how the petrodollar actually operates, picture a circulation machine with 4 interlocking links. The first link, oil on the international market, is priced and settled primarily in US dollars. This applies not only to transactions where the United States is a buyer or seller. When Japan buys oil from Saudi Arabia, when South Korea buys oil from the UAE, when India buys oil from Iraq, all of those transactions are denominated in dollars. The US dollar became the common language of the global energy market. The second link follows from the first, naturally. To buy oil, every energy importing nation must accumulate and maintain US dollar reserves. This is not a preference. It is an operational requirement of running an economy. Japan, South Korea, India, Germany, no exceptions. Every nation must participate in the dollar payment system to guarantee its own national energy security. The third link is the one that receives the least attention, but sits at the very core of the entire architecture. When oil exporting nations, particularly those across the Middle East, accumulate enormous dollar surpluses from selling oil, they cannot simply let that capital sit idle in a vault. Their domestic economies are too small to absorb it. They need a market that is deep, highly liquid, secure, and capable of generating returns. And no market in the world meets all four of those criteria at the required scale, except the United States financial market. The fourth link: the flow of dollars from the oil kingdom cycles back into the American financial system in the form of treasury bond purchases, deposits into the global banking network, and investments in equities, real estate, and other financial assets. The loop closes, and then it begins again every day. Every transaction, every barrel of oil traded anywhere on Earth. This circulation loop produces what economists call a network effect. The more nations use dollars to transact in oil, the more rigid the system becomes, and the more expensive it becomes for any actor to switch to an alternative currency. Not because anyone is being coerced, but because every participating entity has already built its entire operational infrastructure, from accounting systems and oil futures contracts to legal standards and settlement protocols around the dollar. According to data from the Bank for International Settlements, as of 2025, the US dollar appears in 88% of all global foreign exchange transactions. The International Monetary Fund records the dollar at approximately 56% of total allocated global foreign exchange reserves, and roughly 80% of international oil transactions are still priced and settled in dollars, according to estimates from the Atlantic Council and independent research organizations. However, those numbers are not fixed. And that is where this analysis ultimately leads. The petrodollar system grants the United States a privilege that no other nation on Earth can match. When the dollar is the currency the world uses to buy oil, the demand to hold dollars becomes a continuous, inextinguishable requirement of virtually every economy on the planet. That means the United States can borrow at structurally lower interest rates than any other country, because there is always a willing buyer for U.S. Treasury bonds. According to data from the U.S. Department of the Treasury, Saudi Arabia alone, as of November 2025, held $148.8 billion in U.S. Treasury securities. This marks a historic high for Riyadh, confirmed by data from Arab News and GCC Business Watch. When accounting for the entire Arab bloc, according to Forbes Middle East, total Arab holdings in U.S. Treasuries increased by $47.1 billion in 2025, reaching a combined level of $315 billion. That capital flow does more than suppress domestic interest rates in America. In a broader sense, it allows the U.S. government to finance its budget deficit at a cost far below what normal market conditions would otherwise permit. This is a structural advantage that no other nation enjoys at a comparable scale. For oil exporting nations, the petrodollar also delivers measurable benefits. Operating within a standardized system with transparent price benchmarks and extreme liquidity reduces transaction costs and currency risk. For kingdoms like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, or Kuwait, where oil revenues represent the bulk of GDP, but domestic markets remain relatively small, the dollar provides a safe, flexible, and yield-generating destination for their massive capital surpluses. However, no architecture of power exists without hidden costs, and the petrodollar system, the more carefully you examine it, reveals structural fault lines that even its greatest beneficiaries cannot deny. Return to the Triffin dilemma we introduced at the outset. To supply adequate dollar liquidity for an ever-expanding global economy, the United States has no alternative but to sustain a persistent trade deficit, meaning it must systematically import more than it exports continuously and indefinitely. That sounds harmless on the surface, but the real-world consequence is that manufacturing jobs gradually migrate out of the United States toward more cost-competitive nations, while the national debt accumulates decade after decade to the point where it has now surpassed $36 trillion. Berkeley economist Barry Eichengreen once described this as a silent trade-off that ordinary Americans almost never recognize. A strong dollar makes imports cheaper and keeps consumer borrowing costs lower. But the price paid for that is the slow, steady erosion of the domestic industrial manufacturing base. This is not an accident or a design flaw. It is an inevitable operating characteristic of the system, and it explains in part why the industrial communities that once thrived across America's Rust Belt have transformed in ways that millions of American workers feel directly in their own lives. The next consequence of the petrodollar, and this is the portion most commonly overlooked in mainstream analysis, is its impact on developing nations that import oil. The World Bank, in a study published in 2023, found that oil price shocks account for more than 38% of global inflation volatility over the period studied, combined with the reality that roughly 70 to 85% of public debt in low-income countries is denominated in US dollars. Every time oil prices rise and the dollar strengthens simultaneously, these countries absorb a double blow. Energy import costs spike, while their domestic currencies depreciate, compounding the real burden of their existing debt obligations. This is the mechanism that has triggered wave after wave of currency crises and sovereign debt crises across Asia, Africa, and Latin America over the past 4 decades. History provided one of the clearest demonstrations of this dynamic. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Western banks, particularly through the Eurodollar market in London, absorbed massive deposits from OPEC nations following the 1973 oil shock. Those funds were then aggressively lent out to Latin American economies hungry for development capital. When Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker raised interest rates sharply in the early 1980s to combat domestic inflation, the debt servicing costs across the entire Latin American region surged in parallel, igniting the worst global debt crisis in modern history, affecting dozens of nations and hundreds of millions of people. Even for the United States, the system's greatest beneficiary, the petrodollar has generated burdens that Washington is finding increasingly difficult to manage. When privileged status is maintained in part by weaponizing the financial system as a geopolitical instrument through sanctions and controlled access to the SWIFT global payments network, that simultaneously creates powerful incentives for targeted nations to build alternative pathways. When the United States and its allies disconnected Russia from the SWIFT system in February of 2022, that was the clearest signal ever sent that access to the global financial infrastructure is not a neutral right. It is a politically conditional privilege. And that message was received immediately, not only in Moscow, but in Beijing, Riyadh, New Delhi, and capitals across the world. To summarize, but this cannot be overlooked, every time Washington deploys the dollar's central position as a foreign policy instrument, it simultaneously increases the incentive for the rest of the world to build an alternative. This is the central paradox confronting American foreign policies in the 2020s. And that brings us to the single most consequential development that most American media failed to cover with adequate depth. On June 9, 2024, the U.S.-Saudi Arabia Economic Cooperation Agreement reached the end of its 50-year renewal cycle, and Riyadh chose not to renew it. There was no dramatic announcement, no press conference, but the decision was noted by the Atlantic Council, Reuters, and numerous independent analytical organizations as a geopolitically significant development. Saudi Arabia subsequently began accepting oil payments in multiple currencies, including the Chinese yuan, in certain transactions with Beijing. However, this is where careful analysis is required to avoid reaching premature conclusions. The fact that Saudi Arabia declined to renew a specific bilateral agreement does not mean the petrodollar system is collapsing. The reality is that the vast majority of global oil transactions are still conducted in dollars, not because a bilateral treaty compels them to be, but because the entire global market infrastructure remains built around the dollar. Changing that requires replacing a complete ecosystem from oil futures contracts on the New York and London exchanges to accounting standards, clearing and settlement systems, and international legal conventions. The BRICS bloc, comprising Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, along with newer members, including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Ethiopia, has set an objective of building an alternative financial architecture. Projects like mBridge, a cross-border digital payment platform developed by the central banks of China, the UAE, Thailand, and Hong Kong, represent concrete signals of that direction. But the gap between signal and reality remains very wide. As economist Barry Eichengreen has analyzed, replacing a global reserve currency does not happen over years. It happens over decades. And it requires not only political will, but the depth of financial markets' legal transparency and institutional trust that no other currency currently achieves at a comparable scale. The de-dollarization trend is real, but it is occurring gradually at the margins, not as a sudden rupture at the center. Distinguishing between those two things is essential to avoid the extremes of analysis, whether the kind that declares the dollar untouchable or the kind that announces its imminent collapse. In closing, but this is exactly the moment to turn the question back on everything we have just analyzed. The petrodollar is the most sophisticated and durable architecture of power that modern financial history has ever produced. It does not operate through direct coercion. It operates by making the alternative choice prohibitively expensive for too many actors simultaneously. But no system is permanent. The Triffin dilemma did not disappear when Bretton Woods collapsed. It simply changed form. The trade deficit, the national debt, and the erosion of domestic manufacturing are real costs being borne by American citizens as a structural consequence of this privileged position. And as Washington increasingly weaponizes the financial system, each use of that instrument adds to the incentive for other nations to build their way out. The question is not whether the petrodollar will last forever. The question is how it will transform, at what pace, and who will shape that transition. That is a question no one can answer with certainty, but it is a question every American who cares about the economic future of this country should be asking and continuing to watch. This system is neither an enemy nor a friend. It is an operating reality of the world we live in. Understanding it does not mean accepting it or rejecting it. Understanding it means you are now seeing the board more completely, more deeply, and more clearly than those who only look at the gas price today. And that is precisely what this analysis set out to give you. I'm Tommy, and this channel delivers comprehensive objective analysis of the American and global economy. If this gave you value, hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss what we put out next.